My name is Emeott Patel, and similar to Jen, I'm one of uAspire's national board members and the co-chair for this evening's event. And uAspire's mission to ensure all young people have access to an affordable college degree is something that's been near and dear to my wife's heart and my heart. Madhu Punjabi is my wife. She's on this call as well. And being the children of immigrants, we've seen the impact that a college education has had on our parents' lives and subsequently our lives, and a major reason why we've been supporters of uAspire. And the last panel's discussion was quite informative on how online and mobile technologies, kind of offer resources as well as personalizing support to degree attainment during and post COVID-19, which is critical for all students. I'm equally excited about the next panel, which will be discussing the EdTech investment landscape, the importance of leadership diversity and other opportunities as well as challenges for the EdTech sector. Please join me in welcoming 4 of the most knowledgeable individuals about the education technology sector: Natasha from TechCrunch, Jamira from Cowboy Ventures, Claudine from Salesforce Ventures, and Isabelle from Imaginable Futures.
Thanks so much, Emeott. Thank you all for joining us. I'm really excited to talk about the money and where it's going and how we can make it go to the right things, to put it not so eloquently. I would love for the panelists to start by introducing themselves a little bit. First up, we have Claudine. Would love for you to introduce yourself and tell us where you are coming from.
Hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Emeott, and Jen, and the rest of the uAspire board and team, and my fellow panelists. It's really great. This topic is near and dear to my heart as well. I am dialing in from my home in San Francisco. You may hear and or see my children pop in the background, which is now a common and I think delightful occurrence in this global pandemic that we're in. But it also has notions of distance learning and educational equity always top of mind for me as a parent as well as an investor. I work at Salesforce, where I lead an impact fund. We focus on investing in enterprise technology solutions, and we look for both strategic connections to our platform as well as demonstrable social and environmental impact. And one of the core areas that we invest in is education technology as well as workforce development.
Amazing. Well, I think your kids will be more appreciated than their parents in the background who might make an appearance. So we shall see what happens. Jamira, would love for you to also give us a little introduction.
Thanks, Natasha. And thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be on this panel, especially with a lot of my friends that I already know and love so dearly. I am Jamira. I am currently at Cowboy Ventures. We are a seed stage focused firm, so we're investing in early stage companies. We are a generalist firm based out here in Palo Alto, but I tend to focus on anything related to the future of work. And I always describe it as things that are not necessarily collaboration or productivity software, but rather companies, products, and services that actually help people become agents of their career and agents of their lives. And so I spent a lot of my time there. And then before this, I was at a firm called Emerson Collective, where I mostly focused on education and employment related companies. And I'm excited to be here in this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. And Isabelle, would love for you to finish us off.
Yeah, hi, everyone. And thank you to uAspire in putting this wonderful event together. Thank you, Emeott, also for the invitation and for your leadership here. I work for Imaginable Futures. We are the spin-off of the Omidyar Group focused on education. The Omidyar Group is a philanthropic investment vehicle of the Omidyar family, Pierre Omidyar being the founder of eBay. So in my day-to-day work, I invest both in philanthropy, I make grants into nonprofit, and impact investments into for-profit organizations in the future of learning. And Curtis on the prior panel used some magic word for us, cradle to career. That's exactly what I'm focused on, cradle and career, maybe not the two. So cradle in the sense of early education, most of my portfolio is focused on the early years, as well as adult learners, the career side of the cradle to career. And excited to be here and be part of this discussion.
Awesome. So I think the last panel did a really interesting job of explaining all the partnerships and energy that's needed to stop kids from falling through the cracks and make sure learning happens in a comprehensive and effective way. And the reason EdTech from the venture capital perspective always excites me, because I see like this opportunity to put millions into supercharging one solution over another. It's a huge responsibility. And I know all three of you are decision makers in this way. And so I'm curious, like, just to start, maybe what, where should the money be going, and what are the kind of technologies that are giving you and showing you like a truly equitable opportunity for learners? Maybe Jamira, you can start us off. I know you focus on like the adult learning and lifelong learning space a lot.
Yeah, totally. So in terms of where the money should be going, I guess I'll take a step back and I'll say, like, there are some solutions that lead to equitable outcomes that shouldn't necessarily be venture backed. Like that's the first thing that I should say is like, there are some like things that, and some solutions that need to be created where venture like outcomes and venture backable outcomes like don't make as much sense. Like if you think about, and Natasha, you and I have talked about this a lot, like what venture requires is scale really quickly and really cheaply, right? Like that's generally what you're looking for. And for like some solutions that you're trying to build, it doesn't necessarily work. So like putting that aside, in terms of where I think dollars should be going, I'm personally spending a lot of time looking at adult learning solutions that are rethinking how we think of traditional college settings to be more affordable, to be more accessible, particularly in careers where you are able to develop really strong relationships with employers and be able to place students in those careers. And the reason why like I think that's important is that that's not true right now for a lot of careers. The reason why boot camp started with software engineers is because it was pretty easy to assess software engineers to begin with, right? Like there is a technical assessment that employers can say like, okay, this person knows how to do this job. And now we can translate that to other jobs, but there's a lot of jobs where that doesn't exist. And so we're spending a lot of time looking at solutions like in healthcare, for example, or in manufacturing or in cybersecurity, where you're able to actually build relationships with employers and be able to place people in those opportunities. And so ultimately really looking for companies and players that are able to make current alternative learning higher ed solutions, again, more affordable, more accessible, and also actually more effective than how we think of a lot of colleges and universities right now.
Yeah, Claudine, I would love for you to chime in here from the perspective of impact investing at Salesforce.
Absolutely. And, I agree with Jomayra's first point that not all solutions out there should be venture backed. And I think if you look at Salesforce's work more broadly across the education and workforce development spectrum, you see Jen Stradler's great work on the .org side, supporting a host of fantastic nonprofits that are doing fantastic work when it comes to education and college access and workforce development. And Salesforce is also supported with a lot of money our large urban public school districts where we have a presence. So, I think that there's a lot of money that needs to come from, private philanthropy as well as government, of course. Venture is a piece of that puzzle for certain solutions. We so far in our 3+ years of investing for impact have focused primarily on the higher ed space as well as the workforce development space. And that's because we are very much a strategic investor. So we kind of go where our products lead us. Salesforce has for a long time sold into higher ed. We have a big presence there. And our solutions for higher ed are wide ranging and really start with, everything from admissions to recruiting all the way through donor advancement, but there's a growing focus on student success within higher ed. And so from an impact perspective, that's where I focus my time. Our broad goal within our EdTech and workforce development investment streams is to increase more equitable opportunities for populations who have been traditionally underserved for various reasons, to ensure more equitable outcomes in education that ultimately lead to high quality jobs. And so, when it comes to higher ed, thinking about student success products that increase student persistence, for example, since we know that, a good 40% of people who start college don't finish and end up graduating with also a ton of debt. We have also looked a lot at workforce development, given our own role in, digital transformation. We recognize that as a company, we have an opportunity to, help create a new job ecosystem for people to get access to jobs of not just the future, but today, that don't require necessarily a four-year college degree. And so similarly to Jamira, we're very interested in solutions that are tied to, employers, whether it's industry specific or not, and we see our own role in that, and we can benefit from it by training people and finding solutions that generally benefit the digitally transformed environment of today.
Yeah, Isabelle, please chime in with your earlier education investing, because I understand you also kind of look at K through 12.
Yeah, and one point of connection is about the college student population, which actually is quite large, which we call student parents. 1 out of 4 college students is also a parent. And that group of students is one that typically is duly motivated for their children and for themselves. And so access to childcare is critical for that population. So childcare overall in the crisis that we are in right now is critical for many parents that are not necessarily studying but maybe working, but certainly for student parents is a critical need. So we have made a number of investments in childcare, and that's an area where we would love to see more innovation. Other areas of exciting innovation, parental engagement is also another area where during the crisis, if any one of you is a parent, we are all feeling this void right now of connecting with schools and with the education of our children. So there are some digital tools that are looking at new forms of family engagement that are really exciting. And then in the area of education to career, a lot of needs in navigation guidance overall. The future of work is quite murky. So how do we guide people toward jobs of the future that may or may not exist today?
Totally. I think something that I'm curious if you guys are seeing this too is like a lot of solutions out there are putting the payment pressure on consumers now that sorry, I'm not sure if that my mic got messed up. It's putting it on the consumers now that schools are closed or now that campuses are closed. You know what? Since you're home, we'll make you pay for it and you'll get this really good education, but now you have to pay for it. And so it's creating this divide. And so I'm curious, when you're looking at companies, are you looking for ones that are going the enterprise, slower sales route? Or are you looking at the B2C route, which I think has kind of been broken open by COVID?
I think, sorry, I'll just take a quick stab at this. So at least for us, it totally depends on like whether we're talking about early childhood, K-12, higher ed, because they're all different sets of populations. In general, at least for us, we tend to be shy about companies that are selling into K-12 or like school systems. And we tend to be shy about companies that are selling directly to colleges and universities unless they're planning on monetizing from like the enterprise or the employer side at some point. And so we tend to either focus on enterprise solutions that are selling to employers. And a good example of this is actually a company Claudine and I share, which is Skilled Education. that sells into employers like Walmart and Lowe's and Disney, and is able to provide education opportunities to through college for frontline workers. And so like it's a great way to actually combine the need for equality and impact and equity, but also doing it in a way that can lead to venture-sized outcomes, because they're able to get most of the money either via employers or via the university partners that they have. And so it's kind of like this beautiful model that actually, as it grows, it leads to higher equity. But in general, selling for us, selling into K-12 or higher ed, it's just long sales cycles. It's tough on a venture model. It's definitely not out of the question. We've seen some companies that have done really incredibly, but we have been focusing on more of the consumer side and hoping that at scale, they're able to bend the cost curve so that you can actually increase the amount of accessibility that you can have for larger populations.
I'm happy to jump off from what Jomayra shared. Huge fan of Guild. But as an enterprise software company and investor, that is our thesis. So to contrast, how Jamira and her team at Cowboy invest, we actually don't look for D2C solutions and education technology, but rather we look for enterprise, because we invest with a strategic lens. So we're looking for companies that we can actually partner with and go to market with. And as I already mentioned, we have a large presence in higher ed. So our team running the education cloud is actively looking for solutions that can complement what we are offering universities, and we're also working in K-12 as well. We do have our own hesitations about the lengthy sales cycles in both K-12 and higher ed, but I would say the things that make us feel comfortable about the enterprise approach is one, we know it, and two, I think that it actually is where we get most comfortable in terms of impact and equity, because particularly when you're thinking about like a K-12 solution, if you're selling directly to parents, it's inevitably going to create stratification in terms of who can afford it, who cannot. So from an equity and impact standpoint, I'm most excited about solutions that are targeting large urban public school districts to ensure that the tools are getting in the hands of any student who needs them, and not just in the hands of the parents who can afford them. And then the second point I was going to say is, I think we've also seen a shift in 2020 in terms of sales cycles because of the rapid digital transformation that's happening. What would have taken 5 to 10 years is now happening over the course of 1 to 2 years, as schools are waking up to the fact that they are behind in their digital capabilities. We're seeing that as a company at Salesforce, and we're seeing it with companies that we're looking at as potential investments. And so I think that the sales cycles may not always stay this short, but I think something is shifting thanks to the situation we're in.
Yeah, and for us, because we are impact first investors, while we have a few investments that are B2C, selling directly to parents, there are very, very few of them in our portfolio. We really favor those organizations that either sell to employers or have a employer funding model, or have partnership with government, whether they are school districts, Head Start in the early years, or colleges in higher education.
Awesome. And just want to
Natasha, if I may add, actually, this is one of my biggest concerns right now in the current environment in the venture world. I see some amazing leading VCs coming into education. They all have a consumer thesis, because that's where you can potentially make money in education for middle class and higher income parents. But I'm very concerned that this trend will increase inequities that we are experiencing during this crisis.
Yeah, and just to add to this, I don't think that there's any question that there is an increasing divide over the past year. The past year, and anecdotally, my younger sister is actually working at KIPP over the past year, and even she mentions none of the, like, all of these students will have to likely redo this year. There's no real learning that's happening right now, and understandably so, right? You're at your home, it likely is a chaotic environment. One, like, learning via Zoom is not necessarily the most engaging way to learn. There's so much that's lost in what you would normally have in a traditional classroom setting. You don't have that social engagement that you would normally have. And so there's a lot of learning that is lost in the past year. And the folks that are getting ahead are the ones that are able to afford the pod families or the like pod tutors. And so it's a question of like, there's some things that you're doing as a venture capitalist just by nature of like, this is an opportunity to invest in something that you think is going to get really great returns. But it's not, at least personally, it's not lost on me that a lot of these companies that are succeeding as a result likely will have huge disparities and gaps in terms of student outcomes.
I think one more point I'll add on to that is that a lot of companies do start as D2C, particularly in, say, the digital skilling space, but then they actually are looking to break into an enterprise model too. And so I think that that's another opportunity to reach a wider audience. It brings up, though it can be difficult and challenging sales cycles to sell into employers, it ultimately can be a more cost-effective approach to acquiring students. And being able to access more people who maybe can't pay for the product themselves. And so solutions that Jamira sees or Isabelle sees or I see that are purely D2C right now, a lot of times I see an opportunity for them to eventually also become an enterprise offering, and that can be both good from a business and impact standpoint eventually.
Awesome. Yeah. And I wanted to remind everyone listening in to send some questions over if you have any in the chat function, and I'll get to them. And we're also live tweeting from @uAspire. But I did want to talk a little bit about what you all were kind of talking about just now, which is like this growing even second version of the digital divide. It's the software, it's this learning pods. And I think like, this is a weird question, but like, are there any ways that people can look for red flags early on to make sure they're not investing in those or not trying to contribute to the demand, to the divide? Are there certain questions that you ask or certain things you really look for, even from a website, so you make sure you're not contributing to that potential divide?
I think a really straightforward first question that's always top of mind for me is who are your end users? Literally, who are they? Where do they live? What do the demographics look like? If it's K-12, what percentage of these students are on free and reduced lunch programs? And if it's a higher ed, who is receiving financial aid? What are the proxies we can use to understand essentially how underserved is the population? And I think that is a really good starting point to understanding kind of where in this population the solution is coming in.
The one wrinkle I will add is there is some basic infrastructure work that we obviously have to do around just access to Wi-Fi, internet, access to devices, because there's been research done that shows that even Khan Academy, which is free, has in some ways actually increased the amount of inequity, because the people that have access to internet, Wi-Fi, computer devices, and then parents that encourage them to do it are going to do it versus the ones that don't. And so like, even free options, there's going to be some wrinkle or complication around inequities. And so like, there is a piece around just like the basic infrastructure that also has to, actually most importantly, has to be dealt with before even just like you start thinking about the implications of the business models that you're investing in. But I totally agree with Claudine on that.
100%. There's actually an article in New York Times today about this exact topic. The title is "Think Local About the Digital Divide." And it highlights actually the work of one of our portfolio companies, not in education technology, but in sustainability, that did essentially like a do-it-yourself broadband internet installation in a neighborhood in the Bronx. but it's just pointing out that this is a problem in many places in this country, let alone the rest of the world. So agree that there is some very basic infrastructure that we need to have in place for more equitable outcomes.
Yeah, Natasha, to questions such as, what is the impact that you're having? Very, very direct questions, or how are you closing the gap, whether it's the achievement of the opportunity gap. Those are very, very, related to what Claudine explained on who you are serving, but those are very, very direct questions that we ask all the time. The other question that I like also is one that's more about the team and the leader, the entrepreneur, about the motivations for starting or for doing what he or she is doing.
Yeah. The other question that I think is also important, especially companies that are focused on educating learners, even if they somehow leverage an ISA model or income share agreement model or deferred tuition model, models in which allow for increased accessibility. I spent a lot of time digging into what are the wraparound services, because if you don't actually have the services or solutions to support students to get through the program, that's also related to income, and it's also related to inequity, right? And so that's a piece that helps to that can increase inequity if they're not, even if they're using an accessible or an affordable model, but if they're not serving students that may have more needs, then it can have unintended consequences that you wouldn't otherwise expect.
Yeah, I wanted to end before we get into questions a little bit more meta, which is obviously the panel's about investing equitably and in a diverse way. But I've noticed among EdTech investors, especially EdTech decision makers, just a severe lack of diversity. A lot of the best funded EdTech companies out there have only one, or at most one female on the board. And this panel wouldn't make you think that, but I think there's a lot of room to grow. And so, I would love for each of you to maybe explain, how is this impacting innovation? I don't know if I have a question there, but let's talk about that, because that's just, I think, a blaring gap and blind spot of EdTech right now.
Yeah, actually, EdTech is doing a little bit better than the rest of the venture industry, both on gender, race and ethnicity, and also a lot of educators are starting companies or nonprofits. So diversity from different perspectives. But there is a lot to improve on. And my personal conviction is that it needs to start from the investor side. I think the investor side is still not diverse enough. As you said, Natasha, this panel is exceptionally diverse from many standpoints. But when I look at most of my portfolio organizations, most of the boards that I'm on, those are not the reality that I live in every day. And if you don't start with the investor side, then the networks are not representative of those investors. So, or they are representative of the investors. So in other terms, the organizations are not diverse as a result. So my strong conviction is that the diversity needs to start from the inside of venture and impact investing firms. And good news, if I may conclude there, is that there is a big push from limited partners that I'm observing on that front. A lot of limited partners are investing in more diverse teams. They are asking more questions about the diversity of the teams from the VC side.
Isabelle, in a prior comment, you mentioned that one of the questions you ask is about the motivation of the founders and starting the said enterprise, and that's something that I think about a lot. And I think that when I look at my portfolio, some of the companies that I'm most excited about from an impact perspective are led by founders who created them out of their own lived experience and their own lived experience in a big problem. And maybe that was as an end user in the education environment, maybe it was a teacher. So maybe they had a great, education trajectory themselves, but ended up in a classroom and realized that, the system is just broken. And they wanted to improve it and improve, outcomes for the kids who are not getting access to the same resources as others. And so I think understanding founder motivation is important. It's not a prerequisite to come from an underserved background, certainly to be in our portfolio, but I think, those founders really bring something additional to the table when they're coming at it from that perspective.
Yeah. I guess just to 100% agree both with Isabelle and Claudine. On the investor side, there's obviously a lot of work to be done. And Natasha, just to kind of respond directly to your point around the board, I think specifically within EdTech, there is a fairly diverse amount of investors within that space. But the thing about EdTech is often the companies that are very large are consumer oriented, which tend to be heavily filled with generalist investors. So, and as we all know, 75% of venture capital firms do not have a female partner. And people of color tend to be a rounding error as a result of most decision makers. And so tend to be a lot of white males. And the reality is, similar to what Claudine was saying, is a lot of the decisions that we make and a lot of the perceptions that we have is so driven by our lived experiences. So as a board member, the strategic advice that you're going to give, the networks that you're going to pull from are based off of your lived experience, right? And so if you haven't experienced a lot of the challenges that some of the learners that we serve experience or the users that we serve experience, you're not going to think about it. And I can even anecdotally say for myself, when I'm looking at a solution that is specifically serving learners, I think about my mom, who is trying to go back to school right now as someone who was a teenage parent who English is their second language. And so I think about what are the support services that she needs. When I think about young K through 12 students, I think about what were the things that I needed as, again, someone that was English as a second language, someone that was low income. And so that just drives different decision makings, and it also just drives different questions that you ask, and it drives different ways in which you shape a conversation at a board meeting, and it can lead to drastically different decisions. And so unfortunately, we're in a situation right now where one, it actually starts from the top. LPs are not diverse. And then venture investors as a result are also not diverse. And then the people that we invest in are also not diverse. And so there's a lot of change that has to happen across the spectrum. It's not just investors, it's LPs, it's founders, it's et cetera. It's a whole, set of things that have to change, but it definitely, we can't tell ourselves that it doesn't impact the direction of companies, because it definitely does.
Thank you so much, all of you. That is actually a perfect note to end on, just a realistic, but also hopeful note considering who we are talking to today. And so Claudine, Jamira, Isabelle, thank you for your time.